And we begin in Egypt and take you straight to Tahrir Square, where the protests are ongoing at the moment. In Cairo, tensions remain high in Egypt as crisis talks involving military chiefs, political and religious leaders continue over Egypt's precarious political situation. Well, those are live pictures coming out of Tahrir Square. There are two rallies today ongoing in Cairo. At the moment, there is a pro-Morsi rally also underway in Nasri, but those are pictures coming out of Tahrir Square, the anti-Morsi protest that is still ongoing. Well, Egyptians are anxiously awaiting the outcome of the meeting called by the army following the lapse of the army's ultimatum at 5 p.m. local time. It was just about 3 hours ago. That was the deadline that the military had set for President Morsi to meet the demands of the increasingly large protests in Cairo. There are emerging reports, though, that if President Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood-led government is unable to reconcile with the protesters, the army has reportedly drawn up a plan to suspend the constitution and put an interim government in place. That meeting between the military chiefs, political and religious leaders is currently underway, and we will be bringing you all the details of that and emerging reports from that meeting. We are receiving reports as well that Mr. Morsi is offering a coalition government as part of a solution to the standoff. President Morsi has so far not spoken this evening. While Egypt's armed forces and Islamist President Mohamed Morsi still refused to back down Wednesday as a deadline for a military takeover passed, with rival demonstrators out in force in the streets of Cairo. Military chiefs vowing to restore order in a country rocked by protests over Morsi's Islamic policies issued a call to battle in a statement headlined "The Final Hours." Now, armored vehicles have taken up position outside the state broadcasting headquarters on the Nile River bank, where soldiers patrolled the corridors and non-essential staff were sent home. But there was no other immediate sign of military action to remove the Muslim Brotherhood president. And just a reminder, those are pictures you're watching there live from Tahrir Square, where there is still tension in Cairo, tension in Egypt, as military chiefs, political and religious leaders continue to meet over Egypt's precarious political situation. Reports are indicating that although Mr. Morsi is offering a coalition government as part of a solution to the standoff, the Egyptians there are awaiting word from the army chiefs after the ultimatum to have President Morsi resolve the impasse lapsed about 3 hours ago. Now, the events that have been unfolding in Egypt this week are taking place less than 3 years after the uprising on the 25th of January 2011 against former President Hosni Mubarak. The developments are a strong indication that the people are still dissatisfied with the current state of affairs. CCTV's Yasser Hakim takes a look at the gains and pains for the Egyptian citizen.
Millions of Egyptians hit the streets in carnival-like demonstrations on the 25th of January 2011 that have inspired the world and peacefully ousted former President Hosni Mubarak. Egyptians were fulfilling the dreams of freedom, prosperity and a better life. But 3 years later, and the world was shocked to see the same scenes repeating itself against democratically elected President Mohamed Morsi. This raised questions over what went wrong after the celebrations and euphoria of 2011.
The reality is that chaos has ensued with a host of mistakes from the political and military forces during the transitional period. Parliamentary elections before the constitution was the first mistake, and the rest was built on it. Worst of all was the division within the community between Islamists and liberals. Ideology divisions are dangerous.
These ideological divisions were instigated during campaigning for all elections since 2011. It widened the gap between both sides, which was translated into continuous demonstrations and violence over the last 2 years, even after Mohamed Morsi was elected as president.
The president's main challenge was to unite the country, but he was not able to achieve this. He made mistakes such as his constitutional decree and appointment of a new prosecutor general. He admitted this yesterday, but the opposition were also wrong in refusing to open dialogue with him and preferring to escalate tensions.
There was a security vacuum after the revolution, and it was deepened with the rise of crime and violence. The Muslim Brotherhood accused the opposition of inciting violence and chaos in the country to weaken the democratic process. Meanwhile, the economy was quickly deteriorating, with increasing unemployment, national debt, and budget deficit. The economic burden became so heavy on the citizen that many began to doubt that the revolution was the correct route in the first place.
In spite of the sufferings and confusion felt by the people since the revolution, there is still belief amongst many that the revolution itself is not to blame. The uprisings had its positive attributes.
Freedom of expression and free elections were the major gains out of 2011.
There's no more brutal police force. Political parties have total freedom to operate, and Egyptians can willingly elect their president without fear or fraud. However, all political forces used it for personal gains only. Egyptians misused their acquired freedom, and now the military has intervened, a sign of failure by politicians.
Now Egyptians are back in the streets, saying they will correct the mistakes of the last few years and retain the original principles of the revolution: food, freedom, and social justice. Yasser Hakim for CCTV, Cairo.
We'll continue following the developments in Egypt this evening and bring you more analysis on that developing story from Cairo a little later on in this program. But let's now head to South Africa, where a worrying development in the story of Nelson Mandela's hospitalization is developing. His family has confirmed Mandela is on a life support machine and that they are anticipating his impending death. The 94-year-old former president has been in hospital since June the 8th. And now for the latest on that, let's cross over to CCTV's Guy Henderson, who's joining us from Pretoria. Guy, is this news to the South African public? Is this news to the South African people, public, about the situation developing there regarding Nelson Mandela's health situation?
Well, there are aspects of this that have been reported before. I don't think that the use of the word perilous will come as much surprise to quite a lot of people, given that the presidency for quite some time now have been describing Mr. Mandela's condition as critical. But some of the other information that's come out of this written affidavit by the family, I think really has laid bare, in a way that we haven't really heard before, the seriousness of Mr. Mandela's condition. So as you mentioned there, for the first time, we've had confirmation from the words of the family that Mr. Mandela is on life support in that hospital in Pretoria. That is something that we've seen circulated in the media, but this is the first time it's been confirmed by a member of the family. And probably more disturbing to the South African public, I think, use of this phrase, impending death. Essentially, the family appear to believe, according to this written affidavit, that Mr. Mandela could be close to death. Now, of course, the only thing to mention here is that these were words that were written on Friday, and there have been a few days that have passed since then. So, of course, there may have been new developments that we're not aware of since then. I think possibly the saddest irony of all of this is that throughout this latest health scare, throughout health scares before this, the presidency and the family have drawn a line, really, when it's come to details of Mr. Mandela's health, when it's come to those medical details. They've insisted that those are private matters that shouldn't be reported. Now that these details have emerged, they haven't come from a leak, they haven't been reported through a secret leak to the media, they've come as a direct result of a feud within the Mandela family.
All right, Guy Henderson giving us the very latest details on Mr. Mandela's current health situation. A worrying development indeed. Well, a dramatic development also on Wednesday in the feud among members of Nelson Mandela's family. A High Court judge ordered Mandela's grandson, Mandla Mandela, to exhume and return the bodies of 3 of Mandela's children back to Kunu. The judge also branded the actions of Mandla Mandela as scandalous and vicious. It is a victory for 16 other family members who brought the court action. However, Mandla Mandela insisted a lot of allegations and what he calls dirt were thrown at him, and that he has challenged that in court. Well, CCTV's Renee Delcam is joining us now with more on that developing situation. Renee, well, that is a rather disturbing situation there coming out of South Africa. What was Mandla's reaction to the court ruling?
Well, Mandla Mandela himself was not present in court, but just a few minutes after that order was granted, he told his lawyers to rescind, to ask for an application for rescission. So what we saw at this court this morning were no surprises really. We expected that Mandla would want to have this decision overturned, and that is exactly what he did, just within minutes of that order being granted. And we're told by his lawyers that since the exhumation went ahead without his application, this latest rescission application having been heard, he claims that the family have now removed those remains from his property unlawfully.
Well, Dr. Amanda Esther-Hewson, a historical archaeologist in Johannesburg, is joining us now with more on this situation. Now, Dr. Amanda, in the African culture, though, how do people view, or what is the people's perception to the exhumation of bodies?
Exhumation is taken very, very seriously. You've got to realize that the ancestors' world interacts with the world of the living, and it almost mirrors that of the living. And so any action that you take against an ancestor has implications for the living. And it can cause bad luck, it can bring drought, it can have various implications. It can have implications for an individual or a community or society in general. And so when you exhume, you've got to take it very seriously. You have to have interventions with the ancestors to ensure that they are happy with that. And then special ceremonies are carried out in order to do that. After the exhumation, animals need to be slaughtered. There has to be rituals to give thanks to the ancestors and to ensure that the ancestors will stay effectively on your side and continue to bring goodwill.
All right. Renee, can you give us more details, though, on that exhumation exercise that took place earlier on?
Well, it was a day of much drama and obviously a very difficult and painful day for the entire Mandela family. It started, of course, with that court order being granted at around 1 o'clock in the Mthatha High Court. And just 2 hours later, members of the Mandela family arrived at Mandla Mandela's property along with 3 hearses, with members of the South African Police, with members of the South African Health Department, to exhume the remains of the 3 Mandela children. Now, the media were not allowed to go near the grave sites, but I was told a short while ago by a police spokesman for this area that the remains have all been recovered. All 3 sets of remains have been recovered. They were found in 3 separate graves on Mandla Mandela's property right near his homestead. The graves, I'm told, unlike the Mandela family graveyard, where you see the names of each Mandela family member who had passed away over the years, we are told that these remains were found in unmarked graves. No names, no tombstones, no wall of remembrance, just Nelson Mandela's 3 deceased children in unmarked graves. And while I was talking to you, my colleagues have just alerted me to the fact that one of the hearses just drove by. So we know that the hearses have now been arriving in Kunu, that the remains of Nelson Mandela's 3 children are now back home in Kunu, where Nelson Mandela and the rest of the family have wanted them to be for all these years, and where the family now can rest easily that Nelson Mandela and his children will one day be buried here in Kunu, the place which is so special in Nelson Mandela's heart.
All right. Dr. Amanda, when there are family feuds, though, such as this one, what would you say, though, is the best way out? Going to court or taking it out before the elders?
Well, essentially, it should have been dealt with at the level of the society in the first instance. So it's a little bit strange that these issues weren't brought up in the first instance before those remains were exhumed. Normally, a lot of consultation has taken place, and in fact, the law demands that as well. So the two go hand in hand. It's very seldom that you wouldn't, 1, consult with the next of kin, and 2, that you wouldn't consult with the elders in the society. And so those 2 things really do go hand in hand. In this case, it seems that the elders are actually supporting the reburial of the family members back at Kunu. And so it would seem again that in the first instance, they could not have been particularly happy with the fact that these remains were moved. And in fact, the elders should have been listened to. And if the law had gone or unrolled in its normal fashion, this would never have happened.
All right, Dr. Amanda, though, quite briefly, in the end, it has become a case of back and forth regarding the reburial of the bodies. But does it really matter, though, where somebody is buried?
It does. Remembering that those are your ancestors, and of course the ancestors need to be comfortable, they need to be happy, and we often find in African culture that the ancestors will communicate with the living and say that they are unhappy in a certain position or they're not feeling right, they need to come back. Therefore they are communicate this, and then they are brought back to their same place.
All right, Dr. Amanda Esther Houston, a historical archaeologist in Johannesburg, and CCTV's Renee Delcam. Thank you both. Well, we'll take a short break here on Africa Live, but still ahead on the program.
We mentioned that they violated the mandate of the African Union mission in Somalia. That's the reason why we wanted to have multinational troops.
Somali government wants Kenyan troops out of Kismayo. Let's now go to the Horn of Africa region, where in a rather strong message that might bring about a diplomatic concern between Kenya and Somalia, the Somali government has accused AMISOM's Sector 2 forces of impartiality and a breach of the AMISOM mandate. AMISOM Sector 2 forces are mainly Kenyan troops, whom the Somali government now accuse of siding with clan militia in recent fighting between rival factions in the southern port city. CCTV's Mohammed Hirmoge tells us more.
The Somali government is calling for the replacement of AMISOM Sector 2 forces in Kismayo amid accusations that they have taken sides. The city had witnessed 3 days of intense fighting between rival factions that killed civilians. Deputy Minister for Information says AMISOM Sector 2 forces supported one side of the fighting factions, violating their mandate.
There has been fighting between the different groups in Jubaland who compete in the leadership of the so-called Jubaland, which is not recognized by the Somali government. And it's apparently they sided with the one side. That's why they lost their neutrality.
AMISOM Sector 2 forces are largely Kenya Defense Forces who have liberated the port city in October last year. The Somali government is now asking the African Union for the deployment of a neutral force in the disputed port city.
We mentioned that they violated the mandate of the African Union mission in Somalia. That's the reason why we wanted to have multinational troops, so that they can back to the to fulfill the original mandate, which is to work with the Somali government, not to work with the non-state actors.
The African Union has not responded to the Somali government's demands. Apart from calling for the replacement of AMISOM Sector 2 forces in Kismayo, the Somali government also asked the AU to establish a fact-finding mission to assess the situation in the port city. Mohammed Hirmogi, CCTV, Mogadishu.
The US President Barack Obama has just completed his week-long African tour, which began in Senegal and took him to South Africa and Tanzania. Now, the Senegalese people had expressed hope and optimism. The question now is, were their expectations met? CCTV Desiree Cannon tells us more.
President Obama's trip to Senegal aimed to bolster African investment opportunities for U.S. businesses, address development issues, promote democracy, and invest in the next generation of African leaders. One Senegal official briefs us on their talks with the U.S. president.
He met with a local businessman, and he met with the judiciary of, I think, 9 African countries approximately. The idea was this: democracy cannot thrive unless, the 3 powers, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, are all in their respective way strong. And, no matter how many laws, no matter how many written decisions you have, if people are not determined to enforce law as it should be, that law is not going to be enforced. You get to have a legislation on the table, but you get to have determined lawyers, determined judiciary in order to implement things. So we talk to them in that respect to trust themselves more and to understand the mission which has been assigned to them by the people and to implement it.
But what about President Obama's meeting with the civil society?
Clearly said that he trusted the African youth, number one. And if Africa had to move forward, the African youth should be given more responsibility, given the possibility to have more say in things. But at the same time, they should be given the wherewithal to enable them to empower themselves, that is to say, funding and education. He insisted strongly on education and said that in the area of education, more efforts will be made, and soon you will be seeing more and more African young people getting scholarships and going to study in the United States.
President Obama also made a commitment to support the effort of youth group in Yanama and others. According to Senegal President Macky Sall, Obama's visit repositioned the country on the international stage. Some Senegalese authorities expressed their disappointment.
The envelope he donated
The envelope Obama donated for the NEPAD African countries is not really big. In response to their needs, he just gave them $7 billion. And what is very sad is that he spent more on his trip than what he donated to the African countries. As a black man, we expected he would do better than his predecessors. This is the real disappointment we have from his trip.
The government officials said, contrary to Obama, when Clinton came to Senegal in 1998, he brought $180 billion for African countries, and President Bush $245 billion in 2003. People say they waited for some sort of accord to be signed by President Obama, or at least a public speak, but none came. Some considered the US president's visit an inconvenience. Roads were closed, forcing people from work, and security everywhere was tightened. Others considered it a waste. Those millions of dollars, they say, would be much better spent on the people of Africa themselves. Desiree Canon, CCTV, Dakar, Senegal.
Well, let's now return to our headline story and to the developing story coming out of Tahrir Square. Well, those are live pictures now of Tahrir Square, where tensions remain high as crisis talks involving military chiefs, political and religious leaders continue over Egypt's precarious political situation there. Now, Egypt's armed forces and the Islamic President Mohamed Morsi are still refusing to back down as a deadline for a military takeover passed, with rival demonstrators out in force in the streets of Cairo. Those are live pictures coming out of Tahrir Square, where anti-Morsi demonstrators are camping there, awaiting word from the military chiefs who are currently holed up in a meeting with political and religious leaders. Let's now get more information on that developing situation from CCTV's Adel Mahuri, who's joining us from Cairo. Now, Adel, the ultimatum given to President Morsi has expired. Has there been any statement so far from the army?
Well, so far the army has not given any official statement. As you mentioned, it is currently meeting with all political sects. It is trying to reach a consensus over the transition and how it will proceed with it. It is currently meeting with the Sheikh al-Azhar, the highest Islamic cleric in the country, and the Coptic Pope, and beside the political powers. The army has taken the streets. There's a massive and evident spread of its troops all over the city, particularly around the areas where the Muslim Brotherhood supporters or the Islamic Green supporters are concentrated. It wants to make sure that they are entirely isolated from the opposition in case the announcement happens, and we're waiting for the announcement. Should be any minute now.
All right, Adele, the president has so far refused to adhere to the army's demands, but we understand that he's offering a coalition government. Though, where does this leave the country?
Well, the final details have not been agreed upon or announced yet, but we know that one of the possible scenarios is that the army would give power to a presidential council, which will be formed of 3 people. This is just a suggestion, including or led by the president of the Supreme Council as a form of leadership, because according to the 1976 constitution, he should take power if the president steps down and there is no parliament. In this case, this might be what happened, but there are still many tactics that the army has to face in the government procedures, because forming the government has been one of the main demands of the hundreds of thousands that are here in Tahrir Square, the presidential palace, and all over the city. So the final plan of transition cannot be expected until we know for sure what does the army has in mind. But this also has to be guaranteed with the peaceful process of the transition. There has been a lot of warnings from the Muslim Brotherhood members or leaders that they could retaliate if the army creates a coup against President Morsi.
All right. CCTV's Adel Mahroui joining us there live from Tahrir Square, where demonstrators are still holding out, waiting for any report from the army chiefs who are currently in a meeting. We will be monitoring that developing situation here for you. Now to Ethiopia, where a recent report by UNAIDS named 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa as having cut new HIV infection rates among children by half. Among those, Ethiopia, South Africa, Malawi and Botswana have all made considerable progress. With a perspective from Ethiopia, here's CCTV's Girum Chala.
Almost a decade ago, Ethiopia was reeling under the weight of HIV and AIDS as it spread across the country like a wildfire. Many lost their lives. Many others were bedridden. That was then. The story today is different and remarkable so. According to a report by United Nations on HIV and AIDS trends, Ethiopia became one of the 7 African states which seen a reduction in new infections by a half compared with 2009.
The new incidence of the new infection in HIV is dramatically decreasing, especially after the Ministry of Health, the National launched different programs that help to decrease the disease.
Similar progress has been registered in Botswana, Ghana, Malawi, Namibia and South Africa. Ethiopia's success is being attributed to closer collaboration between the relevant agencies, preventive measures and improved delivery of medical services. Towns like Asosa, 850 kilometers away from the capital Addis, enjoy coordinated health service on HIV and AIDS.
The health workers here are doing a remarkable job in providing health services for us.
The fact being these services given to them separately is good. They also get the services free of charge. The patients get not only ARVs but also OIs for free. They don't pay and they do get good service.
More pregnant women living with HIV were receiving antiretroviral medicines to prevent HIV from being transmitted to the infants. The risk of newborns contracting HIV/AIDS has been reduced by half.
The work from primary preventions, that is preventing the general population from the disease, like providing a free provider-initiated counseling and testing service, so that the patient, everybody who visits the hospital knows his or her own status and take a measure.
Despite the astonishing success of reducing HIV infections in Ethiopia, still challenges remain on clear sight. For instance, border towns like Asosa are faced with numerous possibilities of new HIV infections because of huge refugee camps around and access to health centers. But for now, Ethiopia has every reason to be optimistic in achieving zero HIV infections in the country. Grumjala, CCTV, Asosa, Western Ethiopia.